Hi guys, we are moving on to a new chapter today, and this is photosynthesis. Okay, so moving quite further away, really, from what we were looking at, which was the Sun and Earth Moon system. Now, of course, there's links because the sunlight comes from the sun through radiation, providing the primary source of energy for the Earth, of course, which then allows photosynthesis. We have a reflection of sunlight from the moon. So the sun really is what drives this life cycle, these kind of food chains on our planet. But now we just want to focus on the actual photosynthesis that's happening on our planet. So photosynthesis, I'm sure you know an awful lot about this. When we think about photosynthesis, the first thing that should come to mind is plants. So either you picture, a wilderness like a rainforest and, leaves photosynthesizing mad and producing food, or maybe you picture, farmland where we're producing things like wheat or grass. Or maybe you're picturing a garden where you have loads of different types of plants, and all of those leaves, as we said, are photosynthesizing. So I'm sure you know an awful lot about this already. But what I would like you to do before you even start this exercise is actually put down and put pen to paper and see, what do you actually know about this. 5 things you know about photosynthesis. Okay. So I am going to continue now, and it'll be interesting to see for yourself how many of these points actually you knew already. So our job today really is to look at what we call the word equation and chemical equations for photosynthesis. So we know a bit about chemistry at this stage, and guys, you should recognize, for example, that there is such a thing as a word formula, or there's a chemical formula for these things. So, for example, glucose. The glucose is glucose, but its chemical formula is C6H12O6. So, as part of a chemical equation, that's something I might consider that I would have to write. Another thing then is we want to actually be able to describe how photosynthesis works. So I'm guessing, guys, a lot of you would be able to tell me that photosynthesis is how plants make food, but we want to develop on that and just talk about that process, how it works. We're going to see, we might get this far now today: stomata, xylem, phloem, and the chlorophyll. We may or may not get that far, but we'll see. So, what is photosynthesis? Okay, if we look at the word photosynthesis and break it down, photo means light. Okay, so photography is the whole process of capturing images using light. So photosynthesis is the same thing. Photo means light. And the word synthesis is a word coming from Latin, which means making of. So you're using light to make something, and we know that you're using light to make food. Okay, so this is the thing. But what type of food are they making? Because it's not just like, food you have on the kitchen table. What they're making here is a type of carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate is called glucose. Okay, so in photosynthesis, through the process of photosynthesis, plants will make a very simple sugar we call glucose. Okay, now this is represented here on the diagram in front of you. You're seeing a word equation for photosynthesis. Let's just go through it here for a second, right? So in order for photosynthesis to happen, you've got to have carbon dioxide, which is a gas, of course, in our environment. We have got water. Okay, so water is required for the plant as well for photosynthesis. We've got to have some form of light, whether that is coming from the sun naturally, or maybe it's coming from an artificial light bulb. You've got to have chlorophyll, which is a chemical that's used by the plants to capture sunlight. And if you have all of those conditions, well, then you can make what we really want for the plant, which is glucose. Okay, and then they produce a waste gas, which is not really needed in much quantities for the plant, which is oxygen. So I'm starting off here with a question. I want you to consider, where does this CO2 come from, or where does this carbon dioxide come from? Well, the carbon dioxide could come from multiple sources, but really a lot of it's coming from the atmosphere itself. Okay, so what you should know is that our atmosphere and I've kind of said this over and over, but it's made of 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen gas, and then less than 1% is made up of other gases like CO2. So when a plant is photosynthesizing, it absorbs some of this CO2 in through its leaves, and that's where most of the CO2 actually comes from. You might remember, though, earlier on in the year, we covered something called respiration. Respiration, remember, is the controlled release of um, energy from food. So in the process of respiration, you produce a waste gas, and that waste gas is carbon dioxide. So, a lot of people forget this fact, and that fact is that all living organisms produce carbon dioxide as a waste gas of respiration, and that absolutely does include plants. So, some of the carbon dioxide actually comes from the plant itself when this plant here is respiring. Okay, so it's actually coming from the leaf itself. So that is the sources of the carbon dioxide. And now what we want to do is we want to just look at a little bit more detail on that. So when we're talking about carbon dioxide, as I mentioned already here, we have less than 1% in the atmosphere around us. What I didn't mention here is that the plants actually absorb the CO2 through a special type of pore, okay, called a stomata. Now you might be asking, what's a pore? Well, if you think about it, I'm sure you've heard of this, where people are cleaning their pores in their skin. There's little openings in your skin that allow your skin to be, I suppose, somewhat breathable. Um, but in the same way, a leaf has these tiny microscopic pores, and these can be seen underneath a microscope, as I said. And what they are just little holes, basically, that allow gases in and out. There's actually a blown up image here of stomata, which again is a microscopic structure. As you can see here, there's actually the stomata itself is just the opening of that leaf. So that's how carbon dioxide gets into the plant. It moves straight into the stomata. Usually there's many of them on the underside of the leaf, and then what happens next then is it goes straight to the chloroplasts. So the chloroplasts, remember, are an organelle, which is a cell part in the plant cell, which basically is involved in photosynthesis. Okay, so that is the plant cell. Now, how does CO2 get into the atmosphere? You probably have an answer for that already. How do we put excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? And we've just covered the carbon cycle, by the way, a few weeks ago. Well, you probably should know at this stage, again, that burning of fossil fuels, cutting down too much forestry, all of these things are allowing greater CO2 levels in the atmosphere around us. Okay, the final thing I want to finish up on here today, and that is water. Okay, so water, of course, is another key kind of ingredient here for photosynthesis to happen. And plants, what they do is they absorb water from their roots into the plant. Okay, so they absorb it into the roots of their plant. You can see here that the H2O, which is the chemical formula for water, is being absorbed into the roots and is represented here in blue in this diagram in front of us. So this is through a process that you might be familiar with. Remember when I covered something called diffusion all the way back in first year, and we lit a candle and we waited to see what would happen in terms of the spreading of the scent. And what we found was that the first row smelt the scent first, the second row smelt it second, the third row smelt third. So this is the natural movement of a gas, and it's also the natural movement of a liquid from a high concentration to a low concentration. So what you tend to find is that the soil tends to be full of water, well, particularly in Ireland, and the water naturally moves into the roots of the plants. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Now, it moves naturally into what we call xylem tissue. So this is a special type of tissue in a plant which is designed to carry water. What I want you to picture is for example, a straw. Okay, a straw that you might get in McDonald's or whatever. It's a narrow little tube that's going to encourage water to kind of be pushed up it. I'm sure you probably used straws before and saw how water kind of gets trapped in the straw. It's the kind of same idea in terms of how water moves up this xylem tissue. So, where does the water need to get to? Well, it needs to get to the part of the plant that's involved in photosynthesis, which is the leaf. Okay, so what I want you to learn after today is that carbon dioxide is carried into the leaf through the stomata, and that the water is carried from the roots up through the stem to the leaves, and this is where photosynthesis takes place. The water is carried into the chloroplast because remember, the chloroplasts are what's going to produce the glucose for us after photosynthesis. The big question to finish with today is what happens if a plant does not get enough water? Well, the main thing that would happen is the plant would start to wilt, it would start to shrivel up, and it would be unable to photosynthesize very well because it's not getting enough water to allow photosynthesis to happen. So you see kind of two different things. The plant itself would shrivel up, okay, it's too dry. The second thing you see is it start to kind of go change color, it might go a little bit brown because it's not getting the glucose that it needs because it can't photosynthesize properly. Right, so we'll stop there, I think, for today, and I will come on to this next day then, which is the word equation and the chemical equation and the big differences between that. Okay, so work will be posted on Google Classroom for you to work on this.